So to talk a little bit more about that, I would love to have Carly Tanner come back up and talk a little bit about the study, but obviously it's important because this is another point of collaboration between the Fox Foundation and the Parkinson's Institute.
Thanks very much. So just to recap a little bit, a biomarker is something that will tell you either that you have a disease, or will tell you if you have a disease, is it getting better or worse, right? So a marker of progression, which is what we're talking about here, is something that says, are you getting better? Is this treatment making it better? Is it just the same? Is it getting worse? Okay. So for an example, if you get a blood test and the doctor looks at your red blood cells and says, gee, those are a little bit low, you have anemia, you get a treatment, you go back to the lab, you get another blood test, the red blood cells look better, they say, oh, that treatment is working. We don't have anything like that in Parkinson's disease. We don't even have a test for most people that says, do you have Parkinson's disease or not? As most of you probably know, when you first were diagnosed, all you got was an exam, and probably there was a little bit of uncertainty, and maybe the doctor said, well, maybe you need to come back and we'll look again in a couple of months, and then we'll see if we're sure or not. So that's very frustrating. Our focus in Parkinson's disease and here at the Institute has been cause and cure, right? So to be able to focus on that, we need to be able to monitor how disease is changing in a person. The only way we have to do that is by doing our clinical exam. The big catch when we're looking at treatments that actually slow disease progression is that people can only go without medications for a short period of time, probably a year or so, and then they need to take something that affects the disease symptoms. And the minute you start taking a symptomatic therapy like levodopa, it's kind of all over because your symptoms are better and you can't tell anymore if a disease-modifying therapy is working. So we have this tiny little window of months that we can use to try to evaluate that, even using our clinical exam. So that's one of the reasons that this development of markers of progression of disease are so critically important, because even our best measure doesn't really work in this situation past a short period of time. So the process of developing the PPMI is something that went on over a number of years. Many of us were involved in Dave Weiner was involved in it, I was involved in it, a lot of other scientists from industry, clinicians, basic scientists sat around the table and all sort of said, how would we do this, how would we work this out? And eventually came up with this idea of developing a series of standardized protocols for measuring clinical features, thinking, mood, as well as motor function, also standardized ways of collecting information that could possibly serve as an important biomarker and could be connected to those clinical things that we're measuring. So we're using different types of X-ray tests, some that are called DAT scan that targets the chemical messenger system in Parkinson's disease and is just coming available in the US. So that's one thing we're using to monitor progression. We're looking at MRI scans, which have been around for a while, seeing if new types of MRIs may be helpful. We're doing our clinical measures, and then lots of information is being collected from blood, from spinal fluid, to be able to look for changes in body tissues that may help us. We're probably even going to be adding some new tissues that we'll be collecting in the future, like saliva, that may be a way to try to understand things about progression of disease. So the systematic collection of all of this, connecting everything, collecting it all in the same way, at the same time, in people with Parkinson's and people without Parkinson's disease, is the way we're going to get forward in this biomarker. The other thing that's really unique about the PPMI study is that the information becomes available not just to the people who are working on the project, but becomes available to whoever has a good idea and wants to make use of it. So for the clinical information that we're collecting, it pretty much in real time. So shortly after we collect the data, it goes into the repository, we clean it, right, make sure it's really accurate. It's on the website. And a researcher can say, I'd like to look at this information and ask some questions about it, maybe to devise a study for a clinical trial, maybe to ask a question that that person has about disease. All they need to do is send a little request. We make sure they're legitimate scientists, and no matter where they work, if they work in industry, if they work in academia, they can access this information, analyze it, write their paper, publish their paper, design their trial, do whatever makes sense with it, and move science forward. So this is another really important aspect of PPMI that's quite unique. So it's not waiting until 5 years or 10 years, the end of the study, but letting this be used by anybody with a good idea to see if we can move things forward as rapidly as possible. That's also true about the tissues being collected. So scientists can write a request, say, I'd like to look at this, or I'd like to look at that, I have this idea. It gets reviewed by a panel to make sure that it's logical and sensible, and then people can have access to that to be able to answer the research question that might not have occurred to us who are asking that question. So it's a really, really innovative project in so many ways. Our overall goal is to recruit 400 people with newly diagnosed Parkinson's and 200 people without Parkinson's disease who are otherwise similar, same age, same gender, things like that, from around the world, basically. Right now we have Europe and the US. We're probably bringing on at least one site in Australia and possibly in other countries as well as time goes on. So really huge collaboration. And to be able to systematically collect information over time. This, as I said, it's a collaboration that in its idea stage started as a collaboration between us and industry and scientists outside of the Fox Foundation, like at the Institute. And it's now supported by many, many different companies that are all listed here and in your slides. And it's been going on for a little bit more than a year now. And we have 19 out of the 21 sites are launched and recruiting patients. And they're already on the website. 266 participants have been identified. And you can go in and look at all that information and learn more about PPMI that way. So this is a really unique and essential initiative to overcome that roadblock to moving forward with neuroprotective therapies. The Institute started in the late 80s. This was the site of one of the first trial of a possible neuroprotective agent for Parkinson's disease. A bigger study went on, and it didn't pass muster as a neuroprotective agent for the same reason that is the reason today. We don't have a biomarker of progression, and our clinical window isn't long enough. The disease has enough variability that we have not been able to convince the FDA, even with pretty good-looking evidence, that this is truly a treatment that modifies disease. So we essentially need that, and this is going to, we hope, provide it. And if we're not right in our thinking, the information will still be there. So people can come back in 5 years, and people can come back in 10 years and use this information and look for other things. The other thing that's important is we're going to have information that would not just be looking at progression of disease, but we hope we'll also be able to target things like who's at greater risk of developing dyskinesia, who's at greater risk of developing dementia. So as we systematically follow people over time, we'll look for biomarkers not just of disease progression in a big way, but also who's in a subgroup, and then how can we use that information to help to also develop effective ways to treat, or better yet, prevent the development of those things and prevent the progression of disease.
So we've been talking a lot about disease modification, which is obviously, I think, really kind of the holy grail of why we're really around and what we're really trying to accomplish. But it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of symptoms and sort of unmet needs for people with Parkinson's that we can effectively target even today. And so a lot of our effort is also not just on disease modification, but on how to move and develop improved treatments for some of these unmet symptoms. And so there's really two areas I think that we focus on in particular. There's an area that we kind of broadly define as non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's, and these are sort of the the symptoms that no one really wants to talk about is things like anxiety and memory problems and constipation and these kinds of things that come with the disease. You know, we always think of Parkinson's by the classic motor symptoms of the tremor and the slow movement and rigidity and all that kind of thing. But these symptoms can actually be almost just as troublesome and in many ways reduce quality of life. And so it's something that we want to focus on to try to improve treatments around. Dyskinesias we've talked about before. Again, dyskinesias really are, for the most part, a side effect of dopamine replacement therapy, in particular Sinemet. After a number of years, dyskinesias start developing. As you start taking higher doses of levodopa, you start seeing these sort of abnormal movements that are difficult to control, and it can be very obviously troublesome and disabling for people with Parkinson's. It's sort of a swinging the pendulum to the other side. You know, you usually without your drugs you would be very rigid and frozen, but now when you take the drug, you can't even control your movements and sit still. And so this is another area that we think if we can improve that, if we can reduce those dyskinesias, make them more manageable, then we can actually improve quality of life with the existing drugs that we have. So where are we seeing a lot of excitement in these areas? So this is sort of a short list again of different areas where we're seeing some of this. And again, these are all, what's great about this and exciting here is a lot of these are in clinical trial phases now as well. And so we're seeing a lot of this clinical movement here. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on each one of these because it would, again, maybe a little bit too science and technical. But I think what's interesting that we're seeing here is we're seeing a lot of different approaches to target this. So we're seeing different kinds of brain chemical pathways that people are focusing on. For example, in GluR5, this is basically a receptor in the brain that responds to the chemical glutamate. Glutamate is also, like dopamine, a very important brain chemical that helps the brain function. Various companies are developing drugs that can basically target that system and get around some of the issues that happen when you lose dopamine, including also dealing with some of the dyskinesias that we see. We can also figure out different, better ways to deliver L-DOPA. One idea that researchers have is that one of the reasons we get dyskinesias is because when you take Sinemet currently, you take a pill, levels go up in your body, and then it goes back down again. You take another pill, it goes up, and this sort of peak and valley problem might actually be one of the reasons why the brain is responding in the way it does and develops dyskinesias. And so if we can smoothen out that delivery, make it a little more consistent throughout the day, we might be able to reduce some of those dyskinesias. And so there are companies that are testing methods for that right now. Neurologics, some of you might have heard about, they're developing a gene therapy approach to targeting the circuitry in the brain that's affected in Parkinson's. I like to, whether it's the best analogy or not, I like to think of it as sort of a gene therapy approach to DBS, for deep brain stimulation. But they're also in sort of a phase 2 clinical trials right now as well. A drug, droxidopa, which is again related to another chemical in the brain called norepinephrine. People looking at that for cognitive dysfunction in Parkinson's disease. And then finally, another chemical, serotonin, in the brain that people are looking at to treat dyskinesia. So we're seeing a lot of interesting movement, a lot of focus on different sort of pathways in the brain that people can use and target to kind of get around this dopamine loss problem that people with Parkinson's have, and then ultimately deal with some of these unmet symptoms and some of these side effects like dyskinesia. So we talked a lot about biomarkers for disease modification trials and the importance for having that biological marker. There's sort of an analogous need in the symptomatic space when you're dealing with treatments that are just trying to manage symptoms. And that is having a good measuring stick, if you will, for actually tracking that specific symptom. And so this is another area that the Fox Foundation has been really pushing really hard to try to come up with some very standardized kinds of measuring approaches that we can use for some of these symptoms like dyskinesia and like cognitive function as well. And so I wanted to invite Dave Weiner to come up, and Dave has been with us for a long time on our scientific advisory board and has a lot of industry perspective, and he's going to talk a little bit about sort of how industry views this issue.
Thank you very much, and welcome. I'd like to, in the comments I make, reiterate some of the themes that you've heard from my colleagues here up in the panel and from Fox Foundation. And as I look at therapeutic development for Parkinson's disease, there's really 4 major players in there. One is the academic settings, right? So in this area, scientists at the University of California in San Francisco, or Stanford, or even here at the Parkinson's Institute, who bring an academic setting to the development of new therapies. Right? There's also a industrial setting, and these are for-profit institutions and for-profit entities that are in the business of trying to develop new therapies. Right? A third area is the FDA, regulators, right? They are an active participant in the development of therapies over time, and ultimately those who help to decide whether a new therapy may be effective and safe enough to be warranted for use widely across populations. And the last are the foundations, like the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And historically, over time, there had been not been a lot of collaboration between those groups, and that is significantly changing now. Not just in the Parkinson's arena. This is happening in therapeutic development in oncology or in heart disease, where these different entities are interacting much more than they ever were before. You heard Dr. Nichols talk about this, and I can certainly reiterate that they have a common goal here of trying to improve existing therapies or come up with new ones, and many of these institutions work together. Right? And the industry part of this is a particularly interesting one. And I remember a conversation I had with my father about 10 years ago. He was a small businessman in his career. And I had just joined a very small biotechnology company. And I said, yeah, Dad, I joined this biotech. I said, well, what are you guys going to do? I said, we're going to raise a few $1 million and try to do research. He goes, well, how much money? I said, well, $10 million. Maybe when we get to the clinic, we're going to need $100 million. He goes, oh, really? Wow, that's a lot. What's your chances of success? I said, well, historically, Dad, it's about 15%. And he looked at me like I was crazy. Like, who gives you all of that money to fail? You know, so this is a very, very labor-intensive process from the industrial side. And like everywhere else, resources are limited there, all right? They are not unlimited, and in more recent times, they have been decreasing, okay? So within industry, there are strategic decisions that are constantly made as to where to put your resources, because they are not unlimited, okay? And of all the industry players, only a small number of them, not everyone, works in the nervous system space, in both psychiatry and neurology. Within that space, a number of them do work in the neurologic area and deal with neurodegenerative disorders. Okay? Almost all of those who do work on usually Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease as major sort of disorders within the neurodegenerative space that they commit resources to. In the Alzheimer's side, there are actually a tremendous paucity of existing therapies that are effective. So there's a tremendous unmet medical need in Alzheimer's. And it is a profoundly common disorder as well. So there is a very large, the numbers work well to make investments in Alzheimer's research. Okay? When I think about Parkinson's disease, it's actually one of the areas where we have been quite successful over time. Okay? I look around the room, and many of you, I'm sure, are on existing medications that have been developed over the last 20 years for Parkinson's disease. So anywhere where there's been a history of success, it's often much more likely to continue to go down that path because you may be more likely to be successful in the future. So there is still a significant interest within industry in Parkinson's disease, and really focused on a couple of different areas. One area, which is probably, once again, the area that is most likely to succeed, is to work within the motor system, right? So the existing therapies help improve movement. We understand that system perhaps better than some of the others. And there are a number of companies, both small and large, looking to improve upon the existing therapies to treat movement disorder, the primary movement symptoms in Parkinson's disease. Okay? Another area that everyone is interested in, but is certainly a much higher risk area, is to actually get to the problem of modifying the disease itself, either slowing its progression over time or arresting and stopping the progression. But almost every company, certainly every larger one, is invested in that as a goal, okay? But that's a significantly more difficult goal, all right? Another area that I personally believe industry has been slow to catch up to, but is now beginning, are the non-motor symptoms that Brian talked about, right? So one of the things is, as we became more successful in treating the motor symptoms, the non-motor symptoms became more apparent over time, okay? And I think industry is now spending more and more time on this. And I'll give you an example of collaboration. A number of years ago, we had realized that hallucinations are a big problem in Parkinson's disease, right? They exist probably as part of the disease, and certain medications make them worse. And some of the medicines that we use for hallucinations in other populations like schizophrenia are not tolerated at all in Parkinson's. So remember, we decided to try to do this, and we went to the regulators at the FDA. And they said, well, that's fine and good, but how do we know if a doctor can figure out who has hallucinations? There were no diagnostic criteria, no way to diagnose that, right? And then they said, well, not only that, how are you going to measure whether this actually makes a change in a Parkinson's patient? And so what we had to do was go back to an academic setting, engage academic people. The foundation was very fundamental in this, getting people together, and criteria were established for psychosis in Parkinson's disease. Right? And then another effort was done to look at the existing scales, the ways to measure psychosis. And many of those were actually borrowed from the psychiatric side of things. People who have schizophrenia, and they don't very accurately really capture the phenomenology of hallucinations in Parkinson's disease. But an assessment and newer scales to assess that were developed. And now because of those, there is an advanced molecule in a phase 3 testing right now to try to treat the hallucinations in Parkinson's disease. So that's an example, once again, of an unmet medical need. This is a non-motor symptom in Parkinson's disease, and sort of the collaborations it took to put the pieces in place to actually bring a therapy forward. Okay? And I think one more example I'll give is dyskinesias. Okay? Like Carly had mentioned in disease modification, a number of attempts have been made to treat this unsuccessfully. And many, many millions of dollars, probably well over $100 million, has been spent in efforts in both dyskinesia and disease modification that have not yielded an effective therapy. All right? That gets people nervous in industry, right? You know, you got to sit there and commit that kind of capital with no return. It becomes very difficult. Okay? And one of the key issues Carly mentioned on the disease modification is a biomarker, right? But the problem on the dyskinesia side was we had lots of different molecules that we could predict would be very effective against dyskinesia. We could model it in animals, in rodents, and in primates, and we could very effectively suppress the dyskinesias. But whenever we tried to put them in patients, they didn't seem to work. And one of the issues was we didn't know if we were actually able to measure such an effectiveness, right? So there were a number of scales that measured dyskinesia, developed traditionally by different academic groups over the last 20 years, but we really didn't have any idea if any of those scales could actually measure a drug effect or a treatment effect, which is what you would need, that they are sensitive or responsive enough to pick up a change that you could then go to the regulators and say, here, this is effective. And many of you may be on a medication known as amantadine, which it does have some efficacy in treating dyskinesias. We certainly need to improve upon a drug like amantadine, but the clinicians who see patients say that it is an effective, although limited, but an effective treatment for dyskinesia. So the Fox Foundation listened to this. A couple of industry representatives, I was one of them, I know Novartis was there, a couple of other companies, got together and said, well, why don't we do a trial where we take placebo versus amantadine and take all of the existing scales and measure it and see which one of them may be responsive to treatment. And that trial, I think, is going to report out fairly soon. And once that does, that creates a profoundly important tool, because then we know for the next molecule that industry takes to treat dyskinesia exactly how to measure it. And we also will then know just how big of what we call an effect size, how much of a change is occurred by amantadine, and that we have to do better than that, right, for it to be a viable therapy. Right? So this is an example, once again, where many different players within the therapeutic development arena, you know, the regulators provide input, industry helps to fuel some of this, academia and foundations are working together to build the tools necessary to develop new therapies for Parkinson's disease. So like I share, I think, some of the optimism of some of our colleagues. We're working very hard on this across the. It's not an easy task, all right? It costs a lot of money, it takes time, it takes a lot of effort, but there's a very strong desire from multiple parties to address this problem, and I think that I too am optimistic that we'll get there one step at a time.
So we've talked a lot about a lot of sort of complex science and sort of the complexities of how do you move a drug from the lab into the clinic and all the steps involved, and hopefully have left you at least with some sense of excitement that there actually are a lot of ideas both on the disease modifying side and the symptomatic side that are moving into clinical testing now. And so I think we are seeing a lot of that movement, but it's important to think about really what is probably one of the biggest, most fundamental issues in getting a drug to the clinic is how do you do those clinical trials, how do you do them effectively, and how do you do them quickly? So this is really, we titled this sort of whole presentation as Progress in Parkinson's, How You Can Help. And this is, I really think, the real message we really want all of you to leave with today is how you can really play a role in this broader problem of how to develop treatments for Parkinson's disease. And so just some interesting and concerning facts about clinical trials. Half of trials that end up, half the trial sites that end up enrolling only, basically end up only enrolling one or no subjects in their studies, and so obviously that can be a very complex problem. A good majority of trials end up finishing late due to recruitment. A number of the trials actually that we've funded, that's been one of the biggest problems we've had, is just getting enough people in the trial. And then what happens is the trial enrollment period has to go longer and longer, and you're still sort of paying the bills while you're doing that, and that budget keeps going up. So these trials become much more expensive than they need to be. And frankly, at the end of the day, fewer than 1 in 10 people actually want to participate in trials, and so that is another issue that we have. And so this is really an area where it's not science, it's not complex biology, it's not trying to figure out how to deliver a drug into the brain. It's about how do we get people involved in clinical trials for Parkinson's disease. And again, this is where everybody in this room can really play a role. And so one thing that the Fox Foundation has developed to try to make that role, make that participation easier, is we've launched a website called Fox Trial Finder, which we like to sort of call the Match.com dating service, if you will, for clinical trials. It allows individuals like you to actually create a profile on the site, express your interest in participating in clinical trials. You can put some basic information about the stage of your Parkinson's, sort of basic medications you might be on, and those criteria can then be used to match you with trials in your area that actually might be relevant for you. And so it's a good way for you to see what trials are in your area that you might be able to participate in. But on the flip side, which is really important as well, clinical trial coordinators and researchers can also create their own profiles on this site, express the kind of individuals they need in their trials, and then they can see anonymously if there's anybody in their area who has expressed interest in being in the trial, and then send you a message saying, hey, I don't know if you'd like to be in this trial, you would match our criteria, let us know if you'd like us to reach out to you, and then you can basically say, yes, I would like more information. So it's a two-way street to really get that communication going. So we think it's a very valuable tool. Already we're starting anecdotally to see a lot of movement on this, people who are developing profiles on it and actually finding trials in their area, and then actually being enrolled in those trials. And so I think it's a really exciting time for that. But again, it's really the strong message here is that we can all really play a role in this problem. So that's the end, really, of our formal presentation. So I thank all of you for listening. And again, I know we covered a lot of information, and hopefully some of it is sticking with you.